Okay, everyone, the 21st Annual Convention of Oxford House is about to begin. While we're waiting, let me ask Anna Mabel Jones to stand up.
Hey, Anna.
Anna is celebrating 20 years today. Congratulations, Anna. You remind me how old I am. I think it was just yesterday that you came into Oxford House. This year in Washington, D.C., Oxford House meets for its 21st annual convention. Our 21st annual convention means that it is the 44th year of Oxford House's existence. At each convention, we open the convention in a special way because each of us want to remind ourselves that trying to be our own higher power got us into Oxford House. It was now about 8 years ago that Monsignor Tolentino came down to open our convention, and it is with great pleasure that he is back with us today. And I ask Monsignor, can you open our 21st annual Oxford House Convention?
Good morning.
Good morning.
First of all, I want to thank you. I want to thank you for not following Paul's instruction to shove each other through the door. That would create a very definite fire hazard, Paul. And I want to thank you. I arrived last evening, and I've never seen so many smiling faces. I've never received so many cordial greetings as I have since I've been here. You know, every Sunday, or every Saturday evening, I follow Paul and his wife into church. And I'm glad that you're starting 7 minutes late because he's always on me about how late I start Mass. I don't think I've ever started 7 minutes late, though, but I might have. But I say that only to say how glad I am that we're here together. Last Saturday, the parish celebrated my 35th anniversary as a priest. And of course, Jane and Paul were there. I'm a little afraid of Paul because he yelled at me one time. You didn't think I'd forgotten that?
No, I knew he hadn't forgotten. He's not in the program.
And the only reason I'm not is because he is. We play this game every Saturday. But you know as well as I do that we get out of life what we put into it sometimes. And so I want to ask your participation in this prayer. And your response will simply be, bless the Lord. All right? Because all of us need to begin this day and this convention blessing God. So, bless the Lord, all you works of the Lord. Praise and exalt him above all forever. Angels of the Lord, your turn. Bless the Lord, you heavens.
Bless the Lord.
All you waters above the heavens.
Bless the Lord.
All you hosts of the Lord.
Bless the Lord.
Sun and moon.
Bless the Lord.
Stars of heaven.
Bless the Lord.
Every shower and dew.
Bless the Lord.
All you winds.
Bless the Lord.
Fire and heat.
Bless the Lord.
Cold and chill.
Bless the Lord.
Dew and rain.
Bless the Lord.
Frost and chill,
Bless the Lord.
ice and snow,
Bless the Lord.
nights and days,
Bless the Lord.
light and darkness,
Bless the Lord.
lightnings and clouds.
Bless the Lord.
Let the earth praise the Lord. Praise and exalt him above all forever. Mountains and hills,
Bless the Lord.
everything growing from the earth.
Bless the Lord.
You springs, seas and rivers. You dolphins and all water creatures. All you birds of the air. All you beasts, wild and tame. You sons and daughters. O Israel, bless the Lord. Praise and exalt him above all forever. Priest of the Lord, bless the Lord. Servants of the Lord, bless the Lord. Spirits and souls of the just, bless the Lord. Holy men and women of humble heart,
Bless the Lord.
let us bless the Father. Let us bless the Son. Let us bless the Holy Spirit. Let us praise and exalt him above all forever. Blessed are you, Lord, in the firmament of heaven, praiseworthy and glorious and exalted above all forever. And Father, as we bless you, we are here this morning asking you for a blessing. Bless now the proceedings of this Oxford House World Convention. Bless the members of Oxford House, past and present. Bless especially those who have fallen under the weight of recovery. Bless those who have died. Bless all of those who are in the path of the Hurricane Dorian. Bless the journeys of every single one of us here present. Bless our joys and bless our challenges. Bless those that we have hurt and bless those who have hurt us. Bless us all with strength for today and bless us with bright hope for tomorrow. Continue to bless us with recovery. Continue to bless us with fellowship. And today and every day, bless us with fun. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Mr.
The only reason I'm here is because all the other people that Paul invited said no. And I had both of my knees replaced earlier this year, and my last physical therapy appointment is at 9:30. So I'm very sorry that I can't remain with you the rest of the morning, but it was so great to be here with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. See, that's one of the problems of being a Catholic priest. You spend a lot of time on your knees, and you have to get them replaced. I must say, my knees are in perfect shape. Yet to be used. One of the things that always makes Oxford House aware of its existence and aware of the need that we have to continue to expand is when the local community recognizes the fact that we exist and that the fact that we're doing good. As you look in your programs, you will see that the mayor has a proclamation. And in addition to that, we are particularly fortunate today to have Dr. Bazaron with us, who is the head of the whole department in DC involving alcoholism and drug addiction. Dr. Bazaron, we're anxious to hear from you.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. As was stated, I'm Barbara Bazaron. I'm the director of the District of Columbia's Department of Behavioral Health. Many of you may know that I was also the deputy secretary of the Department of Behavioral Health for 3.5 years. So I've only been back here in the district for 3 months. And I am delighted to be home. I am delighted to be here. On behalf of Mayor Bowser, I have the pleasure of welcoming you to the District of Columbia. We are here today to celebrate the 21st Annual Oxford House World Convention. And as Paul said, this is the 44th anniversary of Oxford Houses. And I am pleased to know that the first Oxford House was founded in 1975 right here within the DMV in Silver Spring, Maryland. While that house no longer exists, we still have the Garrison House in Washington, D.C., which was founded in 1980. And so we have a presence, a continued presence here for this very, very important residence. Many of you know September is what? Recovery Month. And this is really a celebration of the hard work that each person that's sitting in each chair here has really completed to move into and actually retain your recovery. Every day, every day, every day. And congratulations to every single one of you. Absolutely. This is a tribute to you. It is a tribute. The theme of the conference this year is self-reliance. We all know that we all determine our own faith, our own fate, and we really determine our path in life. And you are on the path and the continued path to recovery. So here again, congratulations to that. I have really been a strong supporter of Oxford House ever since I can quite frankly remember. In the summer of 2006, I received a call from Paul Malloy, who asked the Department of Behavioral Health to pay for 2 outreach workers to expand the Oxford House program. This was during my first tour of duty here. I spent 9.5 years here before I went to Maryland. So Paul called me and said, how can you help? And so we set about the process of providing some supports because we knew that everyone, I don't care who you are, wants 3 things in life. And the 3 things in life that every single person wants is you want a home, you want meaningful work or something meaningful to do with your day, all day, and you want people who care about you and people who love you. And so home is important, and you need a clean and sober living environment. And in the district in 2006, we really needed more of that within our environment. So we did, in fact, fund that the care coordinators who came in to help people as they moved into recovery and into Oxford Houses. As of June of this year, Oxford House has 35 homes with a total capacity of 311 residents to support their new vibrant lives right here in the nation's capital. So think about it. Now, this is a partnership. I always tell people that as I sit as the director or the deputy secretary of behavioral health, we can't do this alone. We need everyone to help, and we need partnerships such as the one that we have with Oxford House. And I hope that we continue that partnership for many, many, many years. We have continued to expand our partnership over the past 13 years. This year, we also funded an additional funds for additional 3 houses within our environment. However, one of the things that I want to do is I really also want to recognize someone very special in the audience here. And I'm going to ask her once again to stand up, and that's Anna Jones. And I think you know, this is Anna's 20th year anniversary of her new life. And she has told me her story and told me about her journey. And one of the things that's so important, and one of the lessons that I have learned, and one of the things that I kind of think about as I am structuring the behavioral health system, is the value of people with lived experience, and how people with lived experience need to be integrated into every aspect of our system of care. You cannot sit on the sidelines. We need people like Anna telling the story. We need people to reach back and grab one and bring them over the line. None of us are here except for the fact that we stood on the shoulders of someone else. Peers do that every day. And so thank you, thank you, thank you for those of you who are recovery specialists, those of you who are peers, those of you with lived experience who are sharing that experience and helping people to cross the line and to start on their journey to recovery. So thank you, Anna, personally. Thank you. We love you. So, we will continue to partner with you over the years. Boy, do we have jobs for you as recovery specialists. We have a robust program, and I am personally interested in ensuring that the peer movement moves forward. Here in the district, we are very, very fortunate. We just recently actually submitted a waiver to the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services. And a part of that waiver is to get peer-related services, peer recovery houses fully funded. And so we will see, and we are looking forward to having a positive response from CMS. We submitted our application. It is the first combined application that has been submitted in the nation a few weeks ago, and we are awaiting our determination from CMS. If we get that, we will be able to bill for peer services beginning January 1. And we will have additional services, dollars, that we can then use to support peer-related services. And so cross your fingers, look above, and let's all hope that our waiver is funded. I want to thank all of you for being here. I want to thank you for the gifts that you bring, and welcome once again to the District of Columbia, the world or the state's capital. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bazron. I think as I look out there over the audience, the great thing of bringing together 1,700 folks in recovery who don't drink, don't use drugs, is great in the district. Probably not so great, we hope, for this hotel's bar business.
You're making out with the coffee.
Got to be careful when I say things like that. I hope I don't jinx it for the guy who's here and he's got 2 weeks sober and suddenly I've planted a seed in his head. This kind of convention and our annual convention comes about only because of tremendous hard work by lots of people. But within Oxford House, Kathleen Gibson is the workhorse who keeps everything on track. She has brought to the organization not only a touch of class, but a great sense of organization and the patience and tolerance and understanding of a social worker. Now, in spite of that, I think that all of you would agree that we have gone from a handful of outreach folks to a staff of 163 outreach folks. Primarily because of the skill and organization of Kathleen. And she doesn't do all this alone. I know that there's a convention committee that's done a bang-up job of putting things together for this convention, and that both Jackson and Jason have spearheaded this sophisticated scheme that we now have that really organizes us. I mean, I got codes and other things that I didn't understand at all. But that tells folks how many people attend the convention and how many go to each session. Really, we become modern. All of you who have come from all over the country to this convention need to enjoy it and share not only with everybody who's here at the convention, but make it a point, if you came from the same house, to go to different breakout sessions. So when you go back home, you can share with the people who couldn't make this trip the news, the information, the new insight that you gained. That's what we are as a family. We're kind of like one of those big families where everybody looks out for each other, where everybody enjoys each other, and our family is getting bigger and bigger every year. Right now, there are 23,280 folks living in Oxford houses. That's part of the amazement. The most amazing thing is that all of that exists because of you guys. You guys and gals, I guess is the proper phraseology. But it's because of you living in an individual house, strengthening that individual house, getting houses together within an area to be chapters, getting chapters together to get state associations. And it is you who have done that primarily on your own, without a lot of government. Last year, for example, Oxford House Inc., Kathleen, me, those 162 other people in the outfit, spent about $12 million. Wow. You all, living in the houses, paid landlords, cable bills, and other household expenses of $163 million. As you know, even though Jane kicks me under the table every time I say it, I'm a Republican, and I really like this notion of self-help. But even in my Republican eyes, I am amazed at what you all have done. I'm amazed that in house after house, each of you get together in a weekly business meeting and resolve all kinds of differences. You solve problems, and you have the courage and guts to throw somebody out when they go back to using drugs or alcohol. Those are big deal things. You are setting an example for all of America. In 1835, a Frenchman came over here to Tocqueville, wandered across the country, and wrote all kinds of things about these new Americans 150 years ago. One of the things that he was amazed about is that those 1835 Americans would get together in associations. Sometimes their associations would be temperance organizations. Other times they'd be associations to solve the problem of building a road from point A to point B. But he was also amazed about these Americans that when they would be going down a road or a trail and it would be covered with a fallen tree, they would just get out of their wagons, clean up the tree, and move along. That's not how it happened in Europe. In Europe, you'd have to get permission from the squire. You'd have to get permission from the landowner. You'd have to get permission from the local government. Could you cut up the tree? In America, we don't ask that. We cut up the tree, get on with life, move forward. In Oxford House, you all get on with life, move forward. We don't wrap our hands around each other and cry about the past that may have been unfair to us. Instead, we think of the future, and then we ask, how can we help each other get there? You know of my story, which is a happy ending story. I was a bad, bad drunk and ended up a happy ending story because Jane had me committed to the nut house, divorced me. For 13 years we were divorced, and then remarried me. Fortunately, that was not the last good thing that Jane did. She has continued to help us year after year in putting together an annual report that makes sense, in putting together a program for this convention that reads well because it uses good English. I've never been a big fan of good English, but I'll tell you, Jane is. And she corrects everything I write. As you read that program, there's a lot of stories in there. Those stories are your stories. And it's important that we pay attention to those stories because that's what this is all about. Each one of us, from Anna, who's celebrating 20 years clean and sober today, to the newcomer who's got one day. We all have stories, and those stories are important because by telling those stories, somebody else who is living through the hell of addiction is able to see a path to peace, a path to loving, a path to living. And in most cases, it's a path through Oxford House. Okay, with that, I want to turn this meeting over to Kathleen, and she'll tell us a bit about housekeeping things involving this convention, but also set up the stage for James to talk about the World Council election, because all of us here gather together to do lots of things, learn, to listen, to enjoy each other, to become friends, to build our friendships while sober and clean, but also to participate in the democracy of Oxford House by electing World Council folks. Kathleen.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
I'm Kathleen Gibson. I'm a woman in long-term recovery, and what that means for me today is I haven't used a drink or mood or mind-altering drug since January 15th, 1993. This is just amazing, and I always say this at the beginning, but it's even more amazing this year. I cannot believe how many people are here. A couple of years ago, I talked about how just down the road, in 1999, we had the first Oxford House Convention. I don't even know if we had as many people there then as we have staff now. So going from 180 attendees to looking out on all of you this morning in the beautiful colored t-shirts, it is really a moment to just say, you know, what miracles we are, that this is just amazing. While you're here, I want you to think about connection, connect with people. When I moved into Oxford House, I didn't know how to connect with people anymore. I isolated. Oxford House really changed my whole life with that. I learned to communicate with people. It's been the cornerstone of my recovery. Even though there are moments I feel shy, I've been forced to connect with so many people, and it's been the most wonderful thing. I want you to think about learning something new. We have amazing panels going on. Lots of people had input in them. You've got amazing keynote speakers that will help you learn new things you never thought you even wanted to know, but that might change your life. That's just been a huge thing for me. Other than Paul making sure we are always high class and have stayed in the most wonderful hotels for the last 21 years, he and Jane and the rest of the convention committee have a great ability to put together interesting things for just about everybody. I wanted to mention that in 2018 and 19, we brought on lots of new states. We brought on Arizona, we brought on Florida, Indiana, California. We have outreach workers in all of those states now opening houses. I think we opened over 21 houses in Indiana in 1 year, so that's crazy. Amazing work, all because of the outreach workers. One of the things I wanted to mention about that is that there have been so many people over the years that have said that we can't do it, that this is not going to work, that the inmates can't run the asylum, and as Paul always says, and we have really shown them wrong. You all have shown them wrong that we can do this, that the Oxford House model is just the thing that really works for a lot of people, just tons of people. And since we were across the street from that beautiful brand new Apple store that's in the bottom of the library across the street, if you haven't happened to be there, I just wanted to quote Steve Jobs. He said, "The people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones that actually do." And I like to think we've been crazy enough that we're all changing the world. So with that, attend as many sessions as you can, participate in the election of the World Council, go to different breakout sessions, split up if you're here with friends and houses, go to lots of different things. Get to know folks from other states. I have the best friends from all around the country. That is the gift that I love the most about Oxford House. And enjoy just this weekend. I hope it's a great 3 days for you. It may have already been. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to James McLean to talk to you about voting in the new World Council members.
Good morning, everybody. I have my hearing aids. I didn't hear very good. Thank you. Will the World Council members please stand up here so you can see those guys? Before I tell you about the World Council, how to get into it, I want you to do something, help me do something. I want you to repeat after me 3 times. I feel healthy. I feel happy. And I feel terrific. Now I want you to say it a little louder. I feel happy. I feel healthy. And I feel terrific. Now blow the top of the building off. Thank you. Thank you. That's a tribute to one of my best friends and his wife. I'm sure there are a lot of you out here who want to be on the World Council. It has become one of the greatest things that we have in Oxford House. It's the advisory council for the Oxford House. And I'm sure you want to be there. Some of you who want to be in it because you want to help us grow. There's some want to be in there for prestige. There's some of you want to be in there because somebody said go be in the World Council. What we are looking for are people who want to help us grow, who want to help us build. And so we have a unique way to get into the World Council. Now, to get into the World Council, you have to jump through some hoops. Now, one hoop is a really, really hard hoop to jump through, but I won't talk about that now. I'll tell you that to get into the World Council, you have to pick up a petition. If you are a resident, there's a resident petition. We have these here. If you're an alumni, there's an alumni petition. There are five positions open. So now you simply get a petition at the World Council's desk, which is down the hall, and you get the petition, you get it filled out by 5 residents of an Oxford House, not all in your house, please. And you get this petition filled out, and you turn it in at the World Council's desk by 12 today. Now, it kind of identifies who you are, okay? Then this afternoon, this evening, you will come up here and you will tell the body why you want to be in the World Council. And this is the hoop you got to jump through, because we have a warden-like guy with a stick. I'm just kidding. But Paul will walk behind you because you have 3 minutes or less. Now, he says we want you to take less, but you're not going to take more, okay? And you tell everybody why you want to be on the World Council, who you are, and what you can bring to the World Council. Now, we have been very fortunate that we've had, for the last 3-4 years, we've had the World Council to grow. Unbelievable. We're represented on the board of directors, and we've had a very good chairman who was on the World Council, and he represented us very, very admirably at the board of directors meeting. So he's given us some recognition. So the bar has been set very high for members of the World Council. So if you're going to be a member of the World Council, be committed, be able, and to say to whoever that I want to help Oxford grow, and we will welcome you here to our organization. If you have any questions, the World Council desk will be glad to answer any questions you may have. And thank you.
Thank you, James and Kathleen. I noticed that we got ourselves back on schedule pretty good. We're about 3 minutes away from 8:45 when our next part of our program begins. I suspect it's because I didn't talk as much as I intended. I'm willing to make that sacrifice. I can't help but to emphasize to you, attend as many of these breakout sessions as you can. When you look at that program, there are 25 breakout sessions. Over the years, I've been to lots of fancy gatherings, fancy conventions, fancy stuff for lawyers and doctors and everybody in between. And I'll tell you, there's very few things that have as much content as this convention. You're fortunate that there are so many breakout sessions, that there are so many experts, that you're able to gather so much information to bring back home and share, not only within the Oxford House family, but also share within your communities. I remember when we started out, most of us didn't know where the hell Oklahoma was. After a few years, we not only knew where Jackson was and Ray Caesar and all those other folks from Oklahoma, but we also discovered, what is there, 116 houses in Oklahoma, 135, something like that. About 15% of the folks living in Oklahoma houses are Native Americans. And all of them, or most of them, are very successful in getting recovery. And I challenge any other organization in America to even come close. Not even close. In Texas, we didn't know much about Texas except that Ebby Thatcher, who was Bill Wilson's friend in AA, had lived in Texas for a couple years and stayed clean and sober. And there was a guy named Searcy in Texas whose sobriety date was August 1st, 1944. And he sort of became famous in Texas. And in 1991, James McLean and I went down to Dallas to present a little presentation to folks about, hey, this Oxford House thing. And Searcy was there. And Searcy said, I was getting a little discouraged after all these years in AA, in that everybody was going out to try to make money off alcoholism and drug addiction. And that wasn't the way it was in the early days of AA. He said, we used to take newcomers, bring them home to live with us, and help them get sober and clean. And he said, while I was getting sober and depressed, I suddenly learned about Oxford House. At that point, there were 3 Oxford houses in Dallas. And he said to James and me, this is like the early days of AA. You bring people home, you help them stay clean and sober. Today, I don't know, what is it, 250 Oxford houses in Texas? 270 Oxford houses in Texas. As a matter of fact, all over the country, there's lots of Oxford houses except in my home area of New England. For some reason in New England, there was a tendency to want to invent the wheel all over again. And a belief that only PhDs and folks like that could understand these poor, sick, terrible alcoholics and drug addicts. I understand that in a way because I was in and out of AA before I got clean and sober. And I used to ask my Aunt Sue all about Bill Wilson because she'd gone to high school with him in Manchester, Vermont. And Aunt Sue was very evasive and said, well, I didn't really know him. I said, Aunt Sue, there was only 93 in the high school. How come you didn't know him? And she said, oh, he was a Protestant. So for all of you who think the only differences in America were between black and white, or old and young, or rich or poor, I'll tell you, growing up in Vermont, it was a big deal, Protestant versus Catholic. We have our work cut out for us in getting up to New England to try to get houses. The two states in the country that have no Oxford houses are Rhode Island and South Dakota. And my gut tells me we're likely to be successful in South Dakota even before we are in Rhode Island. And yet we have to go up and convince those New Englanders that Oxford House really grew out of this whole notion of democracy, just like the Congregational Church and the New England Town Meeting. And we have to convince them to do more of that in their hometown. But while we haven't been that successful in planting Oxford houses in New England, we do have great success in attracting folks from New England to talk to us about the diseases of alcoholism and drug addiction. And we're particularly fortunate today because we have Dr. John Kelly here, who is a leading expert in the whole field and who I know helped write the Surgeon General report 2 years ago, which specifically mentions Oxford House as a good thing and as a wave of the future. With that, I call upon John Kelly to come share with us his knowledge so we can learn more about the disease we have and the road to recovery.
I'm delighted to be here with you all. I was getting worried. I was at the. They invited me to come and speak at the Alcoholics Anonymous World Convention in Atlanta a few years ago, and they ask usually a couple of scientists to come and speak about research on AA, and I've done a lot of research on AA, and they said, "Don't bring slides. Don't bring slides. Just talk." So I was saying to the audience then, I said, I'm so dependent on PowerPoint. I said, I have to rely on my higher PowerPoint to do the talk, So I was getting worried there I was going to have to do the same thing. But anyway, I've got some power now with my PowerPoint slides. So, no, but I'm really honored, Paul, thank you and the committee for inviting me to be with you all. I hope that what I've got to say is at least interesting, if not informative, and even helpful this morning. So thank you for inviting me. Thank you for having me. I hope you have a great conference. So I think I have to do both of these things. I have to remind me to click these. Okay, yeah. It kind of looks different. It looks different on there than here. But anyway, we'll get through it. If not, I'll just tell a couple of jokes. I've got some good ones. So what I thought I would do this morning is to talk about long-term recovery, talk about recovery, a national recovery study that we completed recently, and talk about some of the findings from that study. But I also want to give you some context on how we came to this focus on remission and long-term recovery in terms of research. So I'm going to talk about kind of how we got here in the last 50 years. I'll talk about the National Recovery Study, and then why we did the National Recovery Study. I'll talk about the prevalence of alcohol and drug problem resolution in the United States. I'll talk about what proportion of those individuals who have resolved a significant drug or alcohol problem actually identify as being in recovery, and what the predictors are of that self-identification as a recovering person, what the pathways are that people follow in recovery to achieve recovery. I'll talk about what we've done to estimate the number of recovery attempts it takes before people achieve long-term recovery, stable recovery. And then I'll talk about the functioning and quality of life of people in recovery in the United States and what happens over time, and see if we can identify any milestones of recovery. Oh, okay, that looks like a different slide set. That's a different slide set, unfortunately. That's the wrong slide set. I thought it looked different. It's different than the one on here, yeah. Yeah, that's the wrong one. That's the wrong one. It's all right, I think given the time scenario here, I might just have to talk it through. You might just not have to see the slides, unfortunately.
It's all right.
What is it? I'm happy. I'm feeling happy. I'm feeling terrific. I'm still feeling happy and healthy and terrific. So, all right. Well, what I can see here, but maybe you can gather around here, and you can see what I'm seeing. But the so what I was going to tell you is this, okay? I've been reflecting because it's almost 50 years since the declaration of the war on drugs happened in 1970 under Nixon. You know, what was declared then, some of you may remember, or you can still see on YouTube, is Nixon standing and declaring the war on drugs and drug abuse, quote unquote, as public enemy number one. And the story I want to tell you today is how we've come from the rhetoric, the stance, the harsh rhetoric and harsh stance and punitive stance of the war on drugs. The very nature of that terminology and that rhetoric, of course, implies what? It implies a kind of a militaristic, identifiable target that we can defeat. As it turns out, although that was the initial stance to be tough on drugs, tough on crime, we've moved from that in the last 50 years towards a broader public health approach to, quote unquote, the drug problem. If you look at the laws that have been passed in the last 50 years, from the Controlled Substances Act in 1970 to the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, these laws were very harsh rhetoric laws designed to be tough on crime, tough on drugs. The result of that, of course, was what? It was actually an increase in the prison population. Yes, it worked in terms of locking people up. We have about 4.1% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prisoners in the United States. Now, you could argue and say, well, did that? Yes, but it won the war on drugs. No, unfortunately, it did not. That recognition of the failure of the more punitive stance resulted in the passing of laws to, instead of looking at supply reduction only or more focused on supply reduction, on interdiction and stopping supply, was also focusing on demand reduction. Demand reduction is prevention, treatment, and recovery. Now think about the laws that have been passed in the last 20 years. The Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act, the Affordable Care Act, which necessitated substance use disorder was included as an essential health benefit. Okay, that had to be covered by insurance exchanges and insurance companies. Okay, that was a big shift. The Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act, or CARA, has been passed. And again, the idea is to focus not just on supply reduction, but also on demand reduction. I had the privilege and honor of being invited to the first ever National Drug Policy Reform Summit held at the White House on December 9th, 2013. And that was under Governor Kurlikowski, who was the director of ONDCP at the time. And that really was underscoring and making a market shift, national policy shift, away from the rhetoric of the war on drugs towards a broader public health approach. So in some ways, we've gone from the war on drugs to the war on drugs. But we should also remember that the war on drugs, when it was declared back in the 70s, also marked a concerted national federal effort in terms of forging new ground in terms of treatment and prevention and recovery. NIAAA, National Institute of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, was founded in 1970. NIDA, the National Institute of Drug Abuse, was founded in 1974. 1992, SAMHSA was founded. As a result of all the research that's been funded over the last 50 years, we've learned a lot about addiction, both in terms of cause and controllability. We've learned a lot about genetics and genomics and pharmacogenetics. We understand now that just like other complex illnesses or complex disorders from which people can suffer, substance use disorder is also a genetically influenced disorder. That's very clear. That's resulted from the research and the funding supporting that research. We also, in terms of cause and controllability, these two factors associated with stigma and discrimination, which is so pervasive in addiction. We understand also from all the neuroscience findings in the last 50 years, particularly in the last 30 years, through brain imaging and neuroscience, that the controllability, the impaired control to regulate the impulse to use substances, which is the essential, despite harmful consequences, which is the essential cardinal feature of addiction, is that impaired ability to regulate those impulses, have been clarified through our research on neuroscience. We can see much more clearly now what actually happens in the brain, in the subcortical areas as well as the cortical areas of the brain, how those areas are radically impaired as a function of chronic exposure to substances. We've also had, think about, again, just think about the last 50 years, particularly the last 30 years, we've seen changes in our clinical approaches. We've had recognition of the stages of change. Remember the stages of change? Pre-contemplation, contemplation, decision or preparation, action and maintenance. And then treatments designed to address the notion of ambivalence, this notion of ambivalence that people often experience. I do and I don't. And it's great when I'm a clinician as well, and it's great when people come into treatment and they say, you know what, I'm ready to go. Tell me what to do and I'll do it. Those are wonderful cases to work with because they'll do whatever you say, okay? But most people, 70% of people, are coming in because of the police, because of their spouse, because of their family, because of schools. I kind of want to, I'm here, but I don't really want to be here. Yes, I do and I don't. So what do we used to say? We'd say, well, go away and come back when you're ready, okay? Go back and come back. You could be dead by then. So Bill Miller and the kind of the motivational interviewing paradigm, which started in the early 90s, was very important because it really said, look, as clinicians, we can't just say go away and come back later. If ambivalence is a cardinal feature of addiction, and that we need to help patients them resolve that ambivalence. So it made it a clinician problem, right? How do we as clinicians then do something different to really listen. There's a good adage here on the slide. It talks about, what people really need is a good listening to, not so much a good talking to. I think we used to think what people really need is a good talking to. But instead, motivation into interviewing in the paradigm said what people really need is a good listening to. Let's help and see the world through accurate empathy, try and see the world through their eyes. We've had also contingency management, good medications that can help people with alcohol and opioid use disorder. But what I want to get to is this notion of long-term recovery and the focus on long-term recovery that has taken shape. And the reason why there's been a focus, we've talked about addiction as a chronic illness for a long time, but we have not treated it as such. We tend to treat it as a chronic, as an acute illness. People like Tom McClellan, Chuck O'Brien, William White, who have had the privilege of working with and publishing several papers and a book on addiction recovery management with. And Bill was really the guy who, some of you know Bill White, he was really kind of the architect of the chronic disease management or chronic recovery management paradigm. He provided a lot of the terminology and conceptualization of how we think about addressing addiction as a chronic illness. And part of the reason for that is the recognition that it takes a long time for people typically to get into remission after they meet criteria for a substance use disorder. It's reckoned that it takes about 4 to 5 years after the onset of a substance use disorder before people actually start seeking help. It takes a further roughly 8 years on average to get 1 year of remission after people start seeking help, and roughly 4 to 5 treatment episodes in the most severe cases in the clinical populations. What's also noteworthy, however, is even though it takes a long time to get that precious 1 year of remission, it takes 4 to 5 years of continuous remission to be no more likely than anybody else in the general population to meet criteria for a substance use disorder in the next year. In other words, it takes 4 to 5 years of continuous remission to be no more likely to get below that 15% line, because 15% is the annual rate in the general population of meeting criteria for a substance use disorder. So to be no more likely than anybody else out there of meeting criteria for a substance use disorder in the following year, if you've already had substance use disorder, it takes 4 to 5 years. Okay? So what does that suggest? That does not suggest 30 days of rehab and bye-bye graduation, right? What it suggests is long-term treatment models and recovery support structures like Oxford houses, like AA, like other mutual help groups, like long-term clinical recovery management paradigms. By the way, all of what I've talked about, and Paul mentioned this, the Surgeon General's report, I was lucky to be involved in that, fortunate, honored to be one of the authors on that. It's downloadable for free. It's an easy-to-read document. I'd encourage you to read it. It's only 7 chapters. It's got a lot of illustrations in there, and even I can understand it. So what do we do in this national recovery study? Again, the reason why we did this is because people like Bill White have been talking about for decades, look, we've got libraries on the etiology, on the causes of addiction, libraries full of books on all of that. We've got libraries on how to stabilize people, acutely stabilize people, detoxify people. But how much do we know about the factors involved in remission and long-term recovery? And yet, there are millions, tens of millions, turns out, of people in recovery that we could actually do research on, ask them, what's helped you? What's made the difference? What are the things that have done that really help? So we conducted this national recovery study. I'm sorry you can't see these slides. I spent weeks making them beautiful for you. But I'll tell you what, you can have them, okay? I'll send them to you. You can, yeah, you can post them. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, absolutely. We'll post the slides, and you can have them anyway. And I'm happy to send, if any papers you want on the research, happy to send those as well. So one of the first papers we did from this study which was one of the reasons for doing it, was to estimate national recovery prevalence. So we had a nationally representative sample, roughly a sampling frame of 40,000 Americans who were benchmarked to the US Census, so they were nationally representative. And we asked them, did you used to have a problem with alcohol or drugs and no longer do? We kept it broad like that because we want people to self-define problem resolution, and there's a reason for that, I'll tell you, because I wanted to identify also those who identify as being in recovery. And what we found was that 9.1% of the US population have resolved a significant drug or alcohol problem. That's 22.35 million people who have resolved a significant drug or alcohol problem in the United States. About 60%, when we look at primary substance, as you might guess, the biggest one, a primary substance of those in recovery, is alcohol. The National Survey of Drug Use and Health just came out this week, or 2018, and of all the 20 million cases of substance use disorder in the United States, 75% of all substance use disorder cases are alcohol, okay? 25% are other drugs, all other drugs combined. And so what we saw was a large proportion, 60% roughly, of those in recovery had their primary substance as alcohol. We had about 10% of cocaine, about 10% methamphetamine, 6% opioids, 13% cannabis. And what was interesting also, because one of the reasons why I wanted to ask that question, did you once have a problem with drugs or alcohol but no longer do? So I wanted to estimate the proportion of people who identify as being in recovery, who actually adopt that label. And what we found was that roughly half of those who said that they'd resolved a significant drug or alcohol problem self-identified as being in recovery, adopted that label. And what were the predictors of adopting that label? Well, as you might suspect, people whose lives had been more severely impacted by alcohol or other drugs were more likely to adopt that label. So it may serve a self-preservation, maybe self-preservatory in the sense that if your life has been severely affected by drugs and alcohol, you want to keep it right here because you don't want to get burned again, okay? So the salience, the impact that that's had on people's lives, I think, signified that and did predict that adoption of that identity. For those whose lives had been less severely affected by substances, they tended to be a mixture of people who just decided not to identify, didn't want to identify with the notion of recovery, or they just wanted to leave it in the past and not think about it and not talk about it again. Next thing I want to say is about pathways. What did we find in terms of pathways of recovery? What we found was that similar to many other studies that have been done looking at different pathways of recovery, there are many pathways to recovery and all should be celebrated. There are clinical pathways, and these are the more formal treatment pathways that people follow. That's one way that people get into recovery. Another way is through non-clinical but service use pathways like using mutual aid groups like AA, NA, Smart Recovery, etc. And a third pathway is what we call self-management or natural recovery, people who don't use any kind of assistance but still get into remission. What we found in this study, again, we had a broad base of people who self-identified as resolving a significant drug or alcohol problem. 54% used an assisted pathway, 46% did not. 46% didn't use any kind of service whatsoever. No treatment, no mutual help, but got into resolve their problem. And again, when we looked at the predictors of using those different pathways, as you might guess, the ones that were more severely impacted and affected by addiction tended to use treatment and mutual help groups and medications. Those who were less severely affected were able to change without those kinds of external supports. Of the services that were used by people, the biggest one was mutual help groups like AA and NA. About a quarter had used formal treatment. about 9% medications, and about 20% other recovery support services, including Oxford houses and recovery community centers. Well, one of the things, just as a sidebar, because we just finished a systematic review looking at the scientific literature on AA and 12-step facilitation treatments. And because that was the biggest piece of the pie in terms of how people recovered, those who used external services, I thought I'd tell you a little bit about that. Because there's been a lot of misinformation and misconstrual of the evidence base regarding 12-step facilitation and AA in the media, in the popular media and press. But we're just coming out with a systematic review, which will hopefully be published in the next couple of months. It's coming out through the Cochrane system, which is the gold standard of medical science. What we found in this particular review, 27 studies, very high quality, rigorous randomized controlled trials, and 5 economic studies, that interestingly 12-step facilitation treatments compared to other well-established treatments like cognitive behavioral therapy and motivational interviewing did as well or slightly better than these more well-established treatments. Where it really stood out, though, was in helping people achieve continuous abstinence and achieve remission. 12-step facilitation, on average, produced about 50% more cases of complete abstinence over 3 years compared to other well-established treatments like CBT and MET. Now, the other thing, when we looked at the economic studies, there have been 5 economic studies that were included in the report. Not only did 12-step facilitation actually do better in terms of helping people maintain abstinence over time and remission over time, but it did so at a substantially reduced healthcare costs. Okay, it turns out over a 2-year period, people who are linked clinically by clinicians to AA and NA, but mostly AA, saved about $10,000 over 2 years in healthcare costs, relative to people who did not receive that linkage. And they had one-third higher abstinence rates. Now, just taking that alone, translating that into all the people who are treated for alcohol use disorder in the United States, roughly 1 million people per year, if they were all linked to AA, that would save $15 billion just in healthcare costs and produce better outcomes. Now, that's pretty impressive. It's kind of what we want, right? From a public health standpoint, is if we have something, a free, ubiquitous indigenous recovery support resource in the communities in which people live that can mobilize the same kinds of therapeutic mechanisms that are mobilized by formal treatment, that is to say, helping people maintain motivation, coping, self-efficacy, reduce impulsivity, reduce craving, then that's a good thing. In fact, I've referred to AA and groups like it as the closest thing in public health that we have to a free lunch. Think about that. There are millions of people who utilize these resources in the community. And now the evidence supports the notion that I think you all have known for a long time, and many people have known, and the literature is now clarifying that when we actually link patients to these free, ubiquitous, recovery-specific support resources, they do better, and we save money. It's also been shown in the Oxford House. You may have seen the study by Lenny Jason. Again, a high-quality randomized study, randomizing individuals with a substance use disorder to go to an Oxford House after treatment versus to go home to the community and receive outpatient treatment. And the people who went to the Oxford House, and they did a study over 2 years, the people who went to the Oxford House had substantially better substance use outcomes. 65% were abstinent over 2 years compared to 31% of those who did not go. The employment rate, the employment rate over 2 years was 76% in the Oxford House, 49% in usual care. And the reincarceration rate, criminal justice involvement, was 2/3 less in the Oxford House compared to usual care. Okay, so Not only were those clinical and employment outcomes better and criminal justice outcomes much better, but it also reduced cost to society of $30,000 per person over that 2-year period. So again, this rise in the community, what we call recovery support services, Oxford houses, sober living environments, recovery community centers, mutual aid groups, recovery high schools, collegiate recovery programs. All of these recovery support services that have emerged and grown and now being evaluated are showing very good outcomes. Now, it makes sense, right, when we think about an illness, a chronic illness. If we were talking about an acute illness that could be solved within a 30-day period, then we wouldn't need all of this. But the reality is that people recognize what they need, and when it's not available, they construct it. That's what happened with Oxford House, right? People recognized there was a need. It wasn't the government saying we need to create these things. It was people who were suffering and said we need more. We need something else. And this is what has happened with mutual aid. This is what has happened with Oxford Homes. This is what has happened with collegiate recovery. All of these different paradigms. Recovery community centers, which are growing gangbusters all over the country, providing recovery support services, increasing recovery capital in the communities in which people live. Okay, so let me tell you, I'm going to tell you in the time I've got left, I think one of the things I'm particularly interested in and focus on, which is the changes in recovery, what happens in recovery. We had 2,000 people in the sample who reported that they'd resolved a significant drug or alcohol problem. And one of the things we were interested in was looking at what happens to things like quality of life, self-esteem, happiness, distress, and recovery capital when they get into recovery, okay? Again, you can't see this slide, unfortunately, but what I can tell, I describe it to you, is what we saw was a general linear increase in all of those positive indices with time, particularly in the first 5 years, okay? When we looked over the 40-year period, we had people from 1 week in recovery to 40 years in recovery, right? So we had a lot of people in this 2,000-person sample. And what we saw was this steep increase in the first 5 years in self-esteem, happiness, quality of life, recovery capital, and a decrease in psychological distress. So that's what you would hope, that's what we see. But there's some interesting kind of nuances to that story. So first of all, let me say that, you know, in keeping with the point I made earlier, that remember I said it takes 4 to 5 years before you kind of reach that stable point in remission where you're no more likely than anybody else out there in the general population to meet criteria in the next year for a substance use disorder. Well, these data show the same thing. It's a kind of a steep climb in that first 5 years where people are really trying to get back their lives on track and build that recovery capital, get that quality of life back. And that's what is reflected here, because as we see an inflection point that happens round about 5 years, it starts to level off. Still goes up. The good news is that as people stay in recovery, what it looks like is that psychological distress seems to decrease, or people become better able to cope with psychological distress, and people continue to accrue recovery capital. They get happier, quality of life improves, and self-esteem improves. What's interesting was that it took 15 years, however, before this sample reached the same quality of life as the general population. 15 years. To me, that is way too long. Now, and I think part of the problem here has been our cultural psyche about how we treat addiction. We've tended to treat addiction like a burning building. We've recognized as an emergency situation, what do? We put out the fire. But what we fail to do is recognize, yes, we put out the fire, but what about providing the building materials that the person can use to rebuild that building or can rebuild that life? And what about, most importantly, a building permit so that building can be rebuilt. What happens with people with drug convictions is that they can't get a loan, they can't get housing, they can't get education, they can't get they can't get a job because of prior criminal convictions. So they can't get the building permit to even rebuild their life. So this is something that has, I think, stymies people's efforts, and it also, it really diminishes hope that people can have a chance at a better life in recovery. One of the things that we noticed also is that these changes in quality of life and recovery capital not the same for all people. So there were different people, particularly those who had opioid and stimulant use disorders. So those who are using crack cocaine or methamphetamine, cocaine, or opioids tended to have a tougher time earlier on. They took about 2 to 3 years in terms of achieving the same level as recovery capital as those individuals who had other drug use disorders, alcohol or cannabis. And the quality of life didn't improve until 2 or 3 years into recovery, and it didn't get to the same level as those who had cannabis or alcohol use disorders. So what that suggests is that certain individuals, perhaps more marginalized or stigmatized individuals, such as those with opioid use disorder, need more support. They need more recovery capital and in order to achieve the same quality of life as others. We've also found in this study that people with opioid use disorders and heroin histories in particular just have a harder time disclosing the fact that they're in recovery compared to people with other substance use disorders. What does that mean? It means they're feeling a deeper sense of stigma, discrimination, and shame. Now, this is pervasive across substance use disorders, don't get me wrong. This is tough to deal with for anybody just because we're dealing with stigma and discrimination every day. But what we noticed in this study when we looked at by primary substance, opioids tended to have, just people with opioid problems tended to have a tougher time just talking about it, disclosing it to people, and that means that they don't get as much relief, they don't get as much help maybe as others. So we need to do more, and one of my supervisees, Valerie Earnshaw at University of Delaware, is studying this. She's doing an intervention to help people to talk about this better. So just in closing, because I'm out of time, but you can, like I said, you can have these slides, and I'll be around. I'm going to be moderating the panel right after this on research with a really stellar cast of players. But let me just sum up here. Like I said, remember, 9.1%, 22.35 million Americans have resolved a significant drug or alcohol problem. About half of those self-identify as being in recovery, half do not. Those who do tend to have more severe histories in terms of their addiction histories, and approximately half resolve these substance problems without any external assistance. And the quality of life indices, when we look at quality of life over time in recovery, we see general increases, particularly steep increases in these positive indices in the first 5 years, which then become shallower. However, it's not the same for everybody. Some people have lower amounts of recovery, access to recovery resources, which we call recovery capital. And it's important to remember that people need those building materials and they need a building permit to be able to get started and give them hope. With that, I think I will leave you alone, and I'll see you later in a few minutes. But thank you so much. Have a great conference.